Good morning, everyone. I'm going to try to do a quick review on Chapter 5 from American Yelp, which is the chapter dealing with the American Revolution. It's tough to do a quick review. I can't do most anything quickly when I talk about U.S. history, especially with the underpinnings of the revolution, the causes, the origins, the events, and the actual battles that took place during the period from basically the 1760s right up and through 1783 when the armistice was signed or the peace treaty was signed. So we start off with what are the, I like how the author did this. He said, hey, there's origins and there's causes. To me, kind of be synonymous in some ways, but what the author's trying to do is suggest there's some underpinnings of what's going on in the American colonies that make causation more likely to be triggered, a catalyst to kick off. And I thought the author did a really good job talking about how, although we're uniquely British in terms of our ideology, most people in the colonies think of themselves as being part of the British Empire in 1763. And why am I using the date 1763? We know that the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War is over. We participated in it. We were celebrating with Great Britain that finally there was not just peace, but Great Britain was the victor, and we're part of it. But tensions start arising, and part of it has to be examined with regard to origins. Some of the thing the book does, I think, is fantastic, talking about what made us a little bit different and what were sort of the underpinnings of what was going on in Europe, Great Britain, and in the colonies that made it ripe for potential tensions between the two entities, even though we still thought of ourselves as one philosophically on some level. One is Great Britain was at war for so long. It was a worldwide war, really. Spain was involved at one point. The Netherlands were involved, but certainly the French. And it really diverted the British attention away from controlling the colonies. This was what we call a period of salutary neglect. I love that term. I didn't make it up. It was actually one of the great parliamentary leaders of Great Britain called that the policy towards America. And the way they reaped benefit from having the colonies was through mercantilism, the trade, the domination and trade, that everything would go through Great Britain. And they reaped huge benefits from it, but not as much as they thought they potentially could get. We benefited from as well, us in the colonies. But now things change after 1763. The war's over. Now Great Britain has a huge physical empire because the French are basically removed from the North American continent for the most part, and they also gain properties in India and other places in the world, and they have to control this huge, vast empire with a sense that they need to tighten control of it, but also financially. They nearly went bankrupt financially as a result of this basically world war that was existing for decades. And so what are they going to do? Well, there's two philosophical groups in the motherland proper, in Great Britain proper. One are the Tories. The more conservative members think, the colonies are here to serve the mother country, and we should start really cracking down, not only in terms of control on how governance works in the colony, but also extracting some of its wealth in terms of taxation and contribution. And there was sort of a second, they were viewing the colonists as sort of a second tier, just an extension of the British throne. They don't get any special rights. They really aren't equal in the eyes of the Tories in terms of colonial representation in Parliament or in the government back in England. That was the more conservative approach. But there's another branch called the Whigs, and they were a more radicalized group of members of the British Parliament who believed that the English colonists were just that. They were English, and they were subject to the same rights and privileges as all English people throughout the world, especially English men. And therefore, it sort of was an argument that the Whigs gave credence to the colonists' view that they had a certain degree of autonomy and the right to a jury trial and the right to be represented in the Parliament. The distinction was that Tories believed you are represented in Parliament. It's called virtual representation. Just because your rep might come from Manchester, England, or London itself, doesn't mean you don't have representation. You do, because there's basically a fiduciary obligation of any representation being responsive to the fiduciary goals of the entire empire. The American colonists had a very different view. Why? Because we had a lot of local assemblies, local council people that served um, in a more democratic forum than they did over in Great Britain. So we had state assemblies, we had local communities that had council people that were picked by members of the community. And that gave us a sense that in order for representation to be meaningful, it didn't qualify as virtual representation. It had to be real. We had to have members from our own community representing our interests, and we weren't allowed to have them over in Parliament in Great Britain. And that started creating an underlying tension. Well, when things are going good, there's no tension, but what happens is certain catalysts start changing the dynamic, and when there's no representation, and then there's tension over certain kinds of taxes, thus the slogan, no taxation without representation, became a mantra of the revolution. So I know I'm kind of scatterbrained all over the place, but you have to set these political ideological differences between Mother England and back home in the colonists. They're similar on one level, but they're different in the sense that in the American colonies, we had little mini sort of republican forms of democracy existing in our local community and certainly on the state level that we grew to love, and it was very responsive to the people. And the other aspect of it was we were more democratized here in the colonies, meaning those people that participated in our local home rule, if you will, were much broader. Yes, they did not include slaves, certainly, and they did not include women, but they didn't include just the richest of the community like they did in Great Britain. The democracy in Great Britain was much narrower. The power of being franchised, if you will, the power to participate in voting was much more limited in Great Britain than it was in the colonists. So the colonists had a more middling, egalitarian aspect of participation in civic life. It wasn't as broad as it is today, certainly, with a very broad, women and all different ethnic and religious groups get to participate. But there was a fairly broad democratic participation in the colonial America. So that underpinning existed as well. The book does a nice job talking about two. One of them I never thought was nearly as big. It's a bit of a mystery to me. Well, isn't religion sort of part of a mystery? But part of it, they're saying also what was occurring during this era that can be explained, help explain why the revolution occurred, was the Great Awakening that we talked about from the previous chapter, especially with George Whitefield. They would go around and tell people that you need to get a personal relationship with God, and the church was kind of interfering in that, and the church leadership wasn't saved. They weren't converted. And you can individually become converted. You don't need the church. You don't need the hierarchy of the church. You are sort of self-determining of whether or not you want to have a relationship with the Lord. And that created an independent spirit, arguably, in the American colonies. And that's what the author's trying to suggest. I don't know if I buy that entirely, but anything that promotes sort of questioning of authority and sort of undermines the weave of authoritarian acceptance probably played a role on some level. I just didn't think it's nearly as important as a lot of different authors. But what I did think was very critical was the philosophy that was going around, both in Great Britain, where the Whigs were adopting it, but especially in the colonies, this great, we called it the Enlightenment. And what was the Enlightenment? We're starting to look for answers for why the world works the way it does, why human beings behave the way they do, what is the meaning of life. These philosophical and education started becoming it had a value to it. We're not going to accept everything as sort of, oh, that's the mystery of the world. That's how it worked. The Enlightenment believed that people were empowered to learn about human interactions. Science was starting to become somewhat more significant in people's outlooks, but also this concept of philosophical belief in political self-determination was starting to become very popular. And the most important, well, Thomas Hobbes was huge too, but the big one that I always like to focus on is John Locke, because when we get to the Declaration of Independence, basically it's John Locke's words, life, liberty, and the big difference there is not the pursuit of happiness that John Locke talked about, but was the protection of personal property, the recognition of rights and property were critical in that political dogma. In the American colonists, certainly the elite leaders in the democratic institutions that we had here in the colonies really bought into that. And so there was this philosophy that we can self-determine our government here in the colonies. We were happy with being British, and we wanted the British rights and expectations that were contained within the British Constitution. but there was starting to get a sense that we weren't being treated equitably under those principles, and we were being treated basically as a conquered territory when certain taxation and events come up. So some of these undercurrents are there. That's where the author is trying to talk about the origins, if you will, versus the causes. So what becomes the causes? We know after 1763, the British Crown needs money. It needs to start exercising control. King George and the Parliament are now controlled by the Tories, the more conservative group, and say, hey, it's time to get a grip on America. The American colonies. We didn't really call it the United States yet, but the colonies are basically a great neglected, salutary neglect, value to us, and we've got to start making them contribute their fair share. And so they start cracking down in a couple realms. One of them that's not talked about enough, it's talked about pretty well in your book though, is that they start putting in more official British authority figures in the colonies to actually run the colonies. That creates a great deal of friction because we believed in our local assemblies, both on the local community level, but also on the state level. And so we didn't like these direct British appointments coming in, which, although we acknowledged the Crown had control, we didn't like the fact that we didn't have a say in who these people were coming in and controlling things. But more importantly, was the taxation. We've never really been taxed directly ever as colonists. There were some ways to make money on tariffs and other things like that, but never a direct taxation. And the first one that comes is the sugar tax. Although the sugar tax was already there, but now they're going to start enforcing it. Technically, they actually reduced the sugar tax, but now they're going to really start enforcing it. And what else are they going to do? They're going to punish smugglers in courts of law, admiralty courts, that didn't have jurors and that were basically going to be adjudicated by Tories, loyalists to the British king and the empire. And that really rankled us. And it didn't last long. It rankled us so much that it actually created the 13 colonies. Well, Georgia kind of stayed out of it a little bit initially, but the colonies started becoming more unified because they're getting upset over these things in a consistent way. And the communication through newspapers and newsprint and letters really started becoming cohesive. And so we started speaking as one people as opposed to 13 independent colonies. Not universally, but it started to create this trend. And so the Sugar Act was getting enforced, and we didn't like it. A lot of people think the Sugar Act came into place. It was always there. It just became enforced, and smugglers were now prosecuted by, previously it was salutary neglect. Just let them do it, no big deal. And then if you were tried and caught, you'd be tried before a local jury that we always thought was part of being a member of the British Empire. We had that right. They took it away from us, and that would create a lot of outrage. It didn't last long, a year or so, because of the outrage and the boycotting and acts like that. The British government backed off. Unfortunately, they come with an even more draconian and more direct taxation, not so much a consumption tax, although it's related to consumption. It's seen as more direct because on anything that's printed basically in a colony is going to be taxed, called the Stamp Act. This one really unified the colonists. We felt like we're being treated like a second-rate citizen. We're not citizens at all, really. Some people unfortunately use the word, we're being slaves, enslaved by the British Crown, which is very sad in terms of the irony that many colonists had slaves, and yet they're saying it's so outrageous to become slaves. But you get the message that the Stamp Act was viewed as horrendous. It was a unifying force in the colonial vision, though, because groups like the Sons of Liberty and other groups came together, and they really, really fought against the Stamp Act, and they drove many of the Stamp Act collectors right out of town. Matter of fact, in Massachusetts, they tore down his house. I believe one of them was tarred and feathered, which is I used to think it resulted in death, but I guess it's not that severe. The hot tar, I don't think it's quite molten hot, but it sticks all over you. They put you in feathers, they humiliate you, they drag you through the street, but they actually tore down his house. And so there was this sense of not only unification in that regard, but if you were a loyalist or if you were kind of a fence sitter, they would take note. These early revolutionary leaders would take note of who you are, and they would blacklist you if you didn't participate in the boycotts, in the demonstrations, and if you work with the British Crown, you became ostracized. It was a really powerful movement, and the Stamp Act did not last long. Also, basically dried up almost as quickly as the implementation occurred. because of the colonies really coming together, seeing such an outrage over the Stamp Act. And the British Crown kept reacting like, I can't believe this is going on. Like, it's really a minor tax. We thought it was very significant. It was even on everything from playing cards to writing a will to getting a diploma from high school or college. Anything that was printed, there had to be an official tax related to it. And it wasn't, we didn't decide to agree to that. And that was one of the conceptions that was born during this revolutionary period, that we're not participating in the parliament. We only decide whether or not we're going to be taxed or not, like the rest of the British people do. It was a bit of I think, a unusual sort of interpretation, but it's nonetheless the ones we've galvanized our historical memory as no taxation without representation. And certainly that's what these people were arguing in their literature. Stamp Act does not last long. And one of my favorite declarations that comes out shortly after its repealing is something called it's not the it is a declaratory act. The declaratory act is basically saying, okay, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but we want to remind the colonists that we're declaring today that the Crown and the British government has ultimate control over the colonies, and we can do whatever we want, and whatever we say is the law of the land. Reminds me of me and my children. I was thinking about this the other day. How can I compare this to like an event that I think is comparable? My kids and I remember I had all kinds of rules in place, right? And the British colonies had the Navigation Act, all these other acts, the Sugar Act, but they weren't enforcing them. And when I was raising my kids, I custom my kids, and were living with me, and I tell them we got all these rules, but what did I do? I let them kind of get away with things. They can do whatever you want. They never really helped with chores. They never really did anything. I was a very lackadaisical disciplinarian with my kids, but the rules were in place. Never really enforce them, but then things change. I bought a house, and I told the kids, I say, hey, financially, things are going to be a lot more difficult buying a house. You guys got to start, following some of the rules. No more eating your room. You got to start at least putting the dishes in the dishwasher, kind of a thing. And, we got a house with a big yard. You got to help me mow the lawn at least once in a while. I got to do these little things. And so what happened? Once I actually remember coming in, because, hey, that's it. You left your room a mess. You ate all kinds of stuff in your room. You left these glasses. Now they're filled up with some kind of mold. I don't even know what they are. That's it. You're not gonna play Xbox tonight. The reaction was unbelievable. The rules already existed, but when I tried to enforce them and make any sanction against my kids, you'd think I was like Attila the Hun. The kids went nuts. And the protest, well, not really protest, but the defiance and the anger was so really virulent that, I was like, oh my God, what's going on? And that kind of reminds me of this. The colonists weren't asked really that much by Great Britain, but because they didn't think they were being treated fairly, and because it was so inconsistent with past practices, that the reaction was so strong. And I would think of that with my kids. And what did I do after I kind of okay, you keep playing Xbox. I didn't want to go to war with them. After I kind of let up on it, what did I do though? I remember making a statement just like that. I goes, all right, I'm the boss of the home. Long as you guys recognize my authority and honor that in the future, we'll be fine. And I remember the kids getting upset with that. The colonists didn't really pay much attention to that declaration. But I know if I were a colonist and I heard Great Britain repealing certain laws that we thought were onerous or inappropriate because we didn't have representation, but then turn around and declare, okay, we're letting you off the hook on this one, but we can still do whatever the hell we want, I would take umbrage to that. I would get really upset by that, just like my kids did with me. So what's the next act? They make a more broad-based set of taxes, which rankles us even greater. The Townsend Acts, and these are taxes on everything. Was it glass, molasses, tea, all the different. This is 1764 Parliament Act, yeah. So it took 3 forms. All these different resolves come down. The colonies become much more unified as the tax acts are done. But then the Townsend Act comes in, and the Townsend Acts was massive in terms of the reaction. There's boycotts everywhere. And this is what really hurt Great Britain and shocked Great Britain, because we hit them where it counted. So there's kind of like multiple prongs approach of what we're doing in the colonies. One is we're protesting, and the elites of our society, the educated, the leaders in the community, they protest, but they're starting to gather together, sort of a nationwide, multiple colonies get together in terms of proposals about what to do against those. But the merchant class were probably the most successful in the boycotts. Not only would we not ship anything over to Great Britain voluntarily, and we really put pressure on anybody that wanted to cooperate with Great Britain, the Tories. And we had plenty of them here in the United States, but they didn't dare, act out, or they'd be tarred and feathered themselves, or their shops would be destroyed. In the others, we wouldn't sell British goods, and nor as consumers on the lowest level, we wouldn't buy their goods. And the boycotts worked because back at home, the British merchants were getting close to bankruptcy. And so they petitioned their own parliament where the representation came right from their own communities. And they backtracked. They recognized that they're killing us economically, and that worked really well. And during this era, it wasn't just the white men that were participating in this early sort of tension that was going on between Great Britain and the colonies. It was also the women, because there was because of the boycott, we had to find ways in which to augment. Remember that the consumer revolution? We love British goods. We like to show that we're becoming a middling class. We like to buy things that were made in Britain. We pushed away from that, and it became homespun goods. If you ever heard that term, homespun means literally that, on spinning wheels. And American colonial women did a great deal to support these boycotts in the recognition that how we're going to find goods and clothes and things like that if we're not going to do these almost universally imports prior to that. It was because of the contribution that women made during this period of time. But throughout history, it takes almost for any other group, the longest would be the women who work on many different abolition all the way through that we can go through history. They're the ones that take the longest to get the vote. In fact, it's 100 years to this year that women were actually enfranchised with the power to vote, but yet they're always fighting for other people to become recognized in terms of equality and fairness. And they certainly did work very, very diligently, and not only to the lead up of the Revolutionary War, but in the Revolutionary War itself. Maybe not always carrying arms, but in other just as important, support roles. So after that, the Townsend Act, they have to backtrack on that almost as quickly as they enunciate it, because of the colonies are getting really close. They're starting to really tie together, and they repeal all except on tea. That comes up a little bit later, but that's not really why the Boston Tea Party happened, because of they had abundance of tea in India that the British company held. In order to help that company, they created a monopoly, and therefore that's all we could pretty much buy was this British tea from the British India Tea Company, and that upset us because it seemed as a tariff, forced basically to recognize that monopoly. I'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, the Townsend Acts are passed in 1767, lead, glass, paint, tea, but it was this consumption tax, again, really, really made us outraged. We do the boycott. The boycott works. Basically, they end it except on tea. But what happens here in Boston is really interesting. They start bringing in troops. And this is, I thought, the breaking point, in my opinion. It's hard to go back from this. When they bring troops into Massachusetts, they don't do it in any other colony, at least none that I can recall. They bring in, we call them the lobster backs, because their backs of the uniforms are like lobsters. If they're laying on the ground, put a lobster next to them, because I can see kind of a resemblance to that in a lobster. But they bring them in, and not only do they bring them in, but where are they going to stay? We don't really have military outposts that we think of today. So they say, they're going to stay in your house and my house. And not only are they not going to pay us compensation while they have to stay in our house, but we're obliged to feed them and kind of, care for them on a certain level. Room and board without pay. And one of the most interesting things the book doesn't talk about, if you really get into the history of the Revolution, many of them were moonlighting. British soldiers didn't get paid that well. So when their duty was done, they go live in your house and you had to feed them. And then they would go out and compete for jobs that you and your neighbors and friends and kids and brothers and sisters would all be competing for as well. So the tension was unbelievable. And the great tension that happened right here in Massachusetts, right on the Boston Town Common. We call it the British Massacre because we tried to portray it as one. It's not really that fair. And it was in March 5th, 1770. There was the lobster backs are basically keeping guard there on the British Town Common. We like to portray it as everyone's beautiful and peaceful, having a good time on the British Town Common. We're playing frisbee and wiffle ball. We're having a good time, and maybe some words are exchanged, and then the cruel British military just guns down our citizens, 5 of which died. One of them a previously freed African American. And they our local governments charge the soldiers with murder. And we call the Boston Massacre. And Paul Revere, the great Paul Revere is right, but he was also a silversmith and an artist. And he drew this print. It's in your book. basically making it look like the British soldiers just basically were executing, colonists. Not really true. These guys were getting pummeled with rocks and ice balls and being taunted. And it reminds me of sort of the Kent State situation where you got a very small military contingent. And they're surrounded by citizens that are being vulgar and rude, and they're starting to throw things. I don't know about you, if you ever got hit in the side of the head with a big chunk of ice, you're getting scared, and unfortunately, someone pulls the trigger. And the good news is, I think it gives a lot of credence to our revolution in that they're not just immediately taken and hung or executed or shot. They're given a trial, and they're given a very fair trial. In fact, the print by it's not in the book, but the print by Paul Revere, one of the jury questionnaires when they're impaneling the jury is, have you seen the Paul Revere print depicting the Boston Massacre? Have you read an article? Have you prejudged this from the things you've heard? Because they didn't want jurors to be biased. So we gave these British soldiers, because I think of myself as American, we gave them the fairest trial of all. And who represented them? One of our great revolutionary leaders, John Adams. He gets up there and does a great job, does such a great job, but he does a great job because he reveals the truth of what happened. And all of them got acquitted of the murder charges. I think a couple got convicted of very minor offenses. And it didn't hurt the revolutionary movement. It did rankle the British government a great deal that the British soldiers were being charged in a colonial court. But it gave credence to us that we're giving the British what they're not giving us: due process, jury trials, because they took those away from us. And it lives in infamy in the colonial viewpoint of, like, we're better than they are because we're willing to follow through with due process and equity in our system of justice. But that was Paul Revere. I always liked that. So finally, they repealed the duties except for on tea in 1770. The tension's still starting to grow. We have the military. And one of the things that's always been in our, well, maybe not today, but for a long time, we didn't like to have a standing military. And that's why we became kind of anemic in the military after the revolution's over. We didn't carry a large military because we thought having a standing military was part of the tyranny. We didn't like having the military in our communities that directly. But the colonies, except for Georgia's having a tough time joining in, but many of their leaders also, I don't want to call them that they were pure Tories, but they had cause to not necessarily be as inclined to get into the revolutionary spirit as the other 12 colonies. In fact, New York, we'll learn later, is one of the ones that doesn't even sign the initial declaration. I don't want to call it the Declaration of Independence, get confused, but there was an initial declaration declaring our outrage and upset, and New York wouldn't sign it because they were about to be invaded by the British military. So there's a new sense, and I like this in the book. It's one of the things I outlined. This is after the Townsend Acts are repealed. It's 1770s now, and I love what the author says here. A new sense of shared grievances began to join the colonists in a shared American political identity. It took a while, but there's correspondence. And why is that important? Because things that happen in Massachusetts you'd think would get ignored in New York and Maryland and in Virginia, but they didn't. There's a new viewpoint. If you're messing with Massachusetts, you're messing with all 13 colonies. And that's the thing that the British government failed to understand, that we were really becoming unified over this decade. It's true. So independence, what happens? We know that as a result of the repealing of the Townsend Act, they think Massachusetts is the real problem. They make a huge mistake. They think Massachusetts is a real problem, and they create a new statute here called the Coercive Acts, which we call the Intolerable Acts. I think the Coercive Act is a bad enough name already. I didn't think we have to name it the Intolerable Acts. We thought they were the same. And we know the story about the Boston Tea Party. There's this basically part of the empire controlled was India, and there was a huge glut of tea. They didn't want this company to go under because it's backed by the British government. And so we basically have a monopoly that we have to buy their tea. Initially, we just wouldn't let the ships come to shore in Massachusetts, and they were sitting out in the bay right up until December. And I think the date is, I should remember this, but the Coercive Acts. And then in the year, I think it's 1774, we basically, Sam Adams and other groups go right out the boat and throw it overboard. And this is pretty much, I thought that was a turning point right there, because now they take away our state assembly. So as a result of the Tea Party, they take away our state assembly, they take away our jury system. British soldiers have any kind of British authority that's charged with any kind of crime gets to be tried up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is Tory run, but so do the British colonies get tried out of county, out of area. And that's why we put in our constitution that if you commit a crime, allegedly commit a crime, you get charged in the community where you're charged. So your peers get to basically evaluate whether or not the validity in the evidence is meritorious or not. We know we have these different groups are sent out now. Because of the Intolerant Acts, and this is one of the most beautiful things at the First Continental Congress in 1774, they tell all the states to start setting up their state and local governments in abstention, if you will. Yeah, the British government is trying to put in their own authority to run the colonies, and basically as a result of the First Continental Congress, leaders are told in every colony, start your own state government and start thinking about writing state constitutions. And we know in the next chapter, we're going to talk about our first constitution is this loose confederation, but we know that, I don't say we know, but I think we're often taught that when the framers go down in 1787 to write the constitution that we currently have, they came with a kind of a clean slate with nothing to work off of. That's nonsense. They were starting as early as 1774, telling the colonies to go out and create state constitution, republican forms of government, that not a direct democracy. Direct democracy was taboo. We didn't like it. That's a rule of tyranny by mobs. We wanted some kind of buffer, and that's called a republic form of government, where there's going to be representative democracies and a written constitution showing the limits on government authority and how people can participate in their republican form of democracy, representative democracy. In Massachusetts, it has the best example of what ultimately the federal constitution will be. 3 branches of government, checks and balances between the 3. So when everyone says, oh, James Madison came up with this really original idea and the other framers saw the magic in it, the magic was already in the state constitutions because of the First Continental Congress sending out representatives to do these things in their communities. All except Georgia did that. They were called committees of correspondence too, and they all were communicating so well, creating that cohesion. It's like anything else. If you can create a line of communication with brethren, like-minded people, telling them what's going on, that helps bind us together as one nation. And I like this, and I'm going to read this quote. I usually don't read right out of the book, but sometimes it's just so well written. It says, in all, the Continental Association was most radical document of the period. It sought to unite and direct 12 revolutionary governments, establish economic and moral policies, empower common colonists by giving them an important and unprecedented degree on groundbreaking political power. It really was. It was. The interesting thing is there was still hope by many people, and this is one of my favorite things. I know this video is going to go long, but you have to. It's the Revolutionary War. Most of us still thought we were still going to go back into the fold, even though there's been bloodshed in the Boston Massacre, even though there's all this economic turmoil between the two countries, even though British troops are getting ready to amass and I don't want to say invade, it's their country, arguably, but they're going to come here and they're going to quash this sort of revolt. There was still a lot of hope that we could potentially go back into the fold. And there's no real statistics on it, but I think there's a lot of evidence that where do we stand on the eve of the revolution in terms of viewpoint? And I think there's a fairly good argument that if we did it in fifths, I think there's a pretty good argument that maybe 2/5 wanted revolution, 1/5 wanted to be loyal to the British Crown and were outraged at the conduct of these hooligans here in the colonies. But I think another 2/5, so almost an equal amount of revolutionaries were what we call fence sitters. And you think about it, if you're doing okay, if your farm's doing okay, your family's doing all right, you're not getting oppressed directly by the British Crown, what's your outlook? You kind of just say, I just want to be left alone. And I watched, I'm not so sure how historically accurate it was, a Mel Gibson movie. I think it's called The Patriot. But that part of the movie I thought portrayed it well. He didn't have anything to do with this thing. It wasn't his war. It wasn't his battle. He just wanted to be left alone. But the Sons of Liberty and other groups would recognize and kind of say, what side are you on? And if you were Tory, you'd be ostracized. Business be shut down. You might be tarred and feathered. You might be running out of town. But if you were a person that I might think I might be back in that era, I might be a fence sitter. And it was hard not to start joining the revolutionary movement when there was some arm twisting going on. To be order to be part of the community, you'd be blacklisted if you weren't basically signing up. So, but early on, even with the revolutionary members, there was a real sense that there was still hope that we might be able to um, uh, create peace. But we know what happens here. It happens here in Massachusetts. There's British military soldiers. They hear there's weapons stored at Lexington and Concord for potential uprising. The British soldiers say we got to nip this in the bud, and they go out. And of course, it's celebrated with the Boston Marathon. Terrible, but it's Patriots Day. Why do we have Patriots Day? And I remember always asking my dad, why do we have Patriots Day? I love it. Another day off. Patriots Day, April 19th, but it was 1775 this time. It's really the shots heard at Lexington and Concord was basically a bunch of Minutemen, potentially tens of thousands of them, basically were picking off significant numbers of the British military, and the British military were aghast at the way in which we fought, hiding behind trees and stone walls, and basically they called us terrorists. I guess it depends on the type of error and what side you're on at any given time, whether you're a terrorist or not. But they lost quite a few British regulars, and they were appalled at the way we fought. We didn't fight in like line formation and honor of the field. It was a new type of warfare. And so they started, we know, April 19th, 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and shortly thereafter, although it's technically the Battle of Breed's Hill, it was misnamed the Battle of Bunker Hill. We lose that. The British government does take Bunker Hill and does take Boston. However, they do it at great loss. There's a famous saying called a Pyrrhic victory, meaning, yeah, you might have won the war, but if you keep winning wars like that, lost the battle, we kind of end up showing that we might have success in the ultimate war, because sometimes a battle is so hard fought and so detrimental to your cause that in the end it shows an underlying frailty and perhaps lack of ability to hold out in the long run. And that's Bunker Hill. We lose Bunker Hill, but we see it as a victory because more British regulars died than militiamen, colonial revolutionary members. The war is on. I don't know how many people died in total. It's just the book says suffered severe casualties in trying to take over the military. And again, the British miscalculation. The other colonies, all except New York, because New York's about to get invaded and they're scared if they sign on to this thing. But the Continental Congress, the second one, they named George Washington, the leader of the Continental military. They say basically we're going to fight. But with that declaration to King George, which was ignored, was also the Olive Branch Petition. You should know that for the exam. What's the Olive Branch Petition? Right, even after guns are fired, colonialists die, British military die in significant numbers, there's still hope that we can come back into the fold if we're simply treated a little bit better and allowed to participate in the democratic processes back in the British government. We know that doesn't work. It gets ignored. And then these things stalled. The king thinks it's sedition and rebellion. He's going to go crush it. He's setting it back. And what changes? Well, what changes is we're in a military conflict now. But what also starts to really galvanize people psychologically is Thomas Paine's common sense. Thomas Paine's a recent immigrant to the United States, but he's got this beautiful mix of writing about a little bit of religious dogma, a little bit of John Locke's dogma, and just a little bit of clarity. Sometimes somebody can write so well. And this pamphlet is printed in mass form, sent out all through the colonies. And those of us that were fence sitters, we see battles are breaking out. We see the British are about to basically invade their own country, but they're about to invade to crush rebellion. And then this pamphlet comes out called Common Sense. And it really does move a lot of fence sitters. Like, I keep thinking I would be a fence sitter. I'd finally say, you know what? This common sense thing, this concept of self-governance, this throwing off the yoke of a monarchy. It's a monarchy. Just because you have certain DNA, you should be in charge. And that caught on with. And don't forget, we have a very big middle class here in America that get to participate in our local assemblies. And the view becomes very, very popular. And so we know that you should know about Lord Dunsmore. He basically is one of the British leaders here in the colonies, and he basically says to any enslaved person, if you break away from your slave owner in rebellion and join the British government, we'll give you your freedom. And they actually pretty much held up that promise. So it didn't have the numbers they expected. And a lot of people say, well, the British were so enlightened. Well, the British helped start slavery in the colonies. So to say they suddenly switched philosophically is a bit naive. But so it wasn't out of humanitarian, it was out of a war effort. And the war effort was to basically undermine the colonial backbone of the will to stay in the fight. And there was an argument in at least the British Empire that the southern colonists were more Tory, they're more likely to stay loyal and maybe not really have the engagement in a revolution as the northern colonies did. And therefore, that Lord Dunsmore proclamation that slaves that ran away from their slave owners and fought with the British would earn their liberty really shook the southern view. But it had the opposite effect they thought they did. They moved many of the slaves to the more interior regions of the South, and it galvanized some of the Southerners to say, those British sons of guns are taking away my slaves, and it really helped engage them into the revolutionary movement, ironically. You should know the case of Somerset v. Stewart. The book should have did a better job explaining it, but this was a British case that basically came down and said once a slave was brought into a free nation like Great Britain, they would earn their freedom, and that put real fear in slave owning, especially in the South. It was a really an interesting phenomenon, the Somerset case, how it really scared slave owning Southerners and other areas of the country, but it was already waning in the Northeast significantly. So we know on May 10th, 1776, there's a declaration. We called it which should really be our first declaration. Congress votes of a resolution that the colonies have to start revolutionary governments, and they're going to throw out all the royal officials, and we're going to have basically our own government in absentia. But we know that, and I've always felt bad for our friend Henry Lee of Virginia on July 2nd makes the Declaration of Independence, but he doesn't do it with this great prose. But he doesn't get remembered in history the way the Continental Congress sets out a commission headed by Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin to write the Declaration of Independence. Becomes famous, but poor Henry Lee gets in the most of us don't remember who he is. I do, because I'm a junkie for this kind of stuff. But and we know that the Declaration of Independence had two prongs. It's not a legal document. Well, it's a legal document in the sense that it's recognizing us as a nation. We're breaking away. But it serves two purposes. I always like to say this, and I think it's important. What's the Declaration of Independence? Well, it's this beautiful document talking about freedom and self-determination. Government comes from the people, by the people, and if they aren't satisfied with the governments that they have, they should choose a new one and have that power to do that. That's all beautiful and well, but it serves two purposes. One is it's declaring our philosophical view of what government should be. And sovereignty, power, doesn't come from the top down. It comes from the people up. And that's a new novel concept in terms of, that era, although we had it in Athens, Greece. But, it's new in terms of world governance at that time. And so one is claiming that that's what our viewpoint is, and that's different than Great Britain. We're going to create a new nation where the power comes from the people. What people, though? We know white male property owners, but that was starting to get lax too about the property owners. In fact, Philadelphia, you just had to be a white male to vote. So it was becoming more democratized on who gets to participate in democracy. But power comes from the people. We're self-determining, and all that John Locke philosophy that we have the power to self-determinate. And government is basically a reflection of what the people want and need. That's the first part. That's the first aspect of what the Declaration of Independence is. The second part is a list of grievances justifying why we need to break away from Great Britain. And it's a list of everything from taxes to no representation. And it's a long list of grievances, and it's a tool used throughout history by Americans that whenever we want to proclaim something, we start off with our philosophical viewpoint, and then we say how the opposition in some way has defied that, and it has longstanding values. And we know there's a lot of hypocrisy in that document. All men are created equal. What about women? What about African Americans? What about people who have certain religion affiliation? Because we know right up to that point, some colonies still barred certain religious groups from participating in the civic life. What about poor? most communities still had property requirements, a certain degree of wealth to participate. So there's a lot of hypocrisy there. But the beautiful thing, we've come closer and closer over time to recognize that the words in the Declaration of Independence should be our aspirational goal, and we've gotten a lot closer to it. Maybe there's still a lot more room to go. That's up to debate. I certainly do recognize that at the time the document was written, July 4th, 1776, there's a lot of hypocrisy in it. In fact, if you look at the first draft, part of the list of complaints that Thomas Jefferson put in, but the Southern states objected and therefore edited it out, was Thomas Jefferson tried to claim that the brutality and the horrors of slavery was put on us by the British government. Well, there's a lot of hypocrisy there. It's okay, it's put on us, but we're still keeping it. Thomas Jefferson had slaves at the time he's writing it, and he's trying to complain about the institution of slavery as being put upon us by the British government. The South would have no part of that objection, because that was sort of an undercurrent that slavery was wrong as an institution on humanitarian values. So that was stricken, but it's there. So there's an undercurrent already with some political leaders that recognition of slavery is as wrong as it is. So we know then the war breaks out. This video should have been kept in two parts. I'm not always crazy about talking about the war. I'm going to try to keep it, because it's I think self-explained in the book very well. We know the war starts off very, very poorly for us, other than Bunker Hill. There's one big battle that's very good. One of my favorite characters of British military leaders, the name of Johnny Burgoyne. They called him Handsome Johnny Burgoyne. He was very handsome and very dashing. He was supposed to meet up with another general, a guy by the name of William Howe. General Howe did not show up. He decides to go down to I believe to the port of New York, and he does not go up to Fort Ticonderoga. It was a huge battle for us, and that's when the French started saying, hey, these guys can pull it off maybe. But prior to that, things were going terrible. The British come right into New York. New York gets overtaken. Things are looking really grim. George Washington recognizes that we have a much weaker continental army than the British can throw against us. It looks very precarious in terms of a military victory. But George Washington changes his philosophy and realizes we're not going to win in any of these pitched battles. We're going to win more by doing choice sort of conflicts that benefit our situation, our manpower, and our equipment, and we're going to just keep surviving, and it'll be a war of attrition, and that's what it becomes. Other than that initial Fort Ticonderoga success, it was pretty poor. New York was dominated. It's not going well, and it's almost becomes a war of attrition. But now the French get involved after Fort Ticonderoga. It's like, hey, these guys could possibly pull it off, and we know Washington's wisdom really pays off. We're not going to go on these big battles. We're going to go on these smaller ones, maybe use some cunning. And the big one is one of the favorites in history, is the Battle of Trenton, Christmas Day or Christmas Eve. Well, I guess it's Christmas Day, dawn. He shows up, and there's a bunch of Hessian troops, which are considered world-class German troops. And that was part of the reason why we thought we also couldn't have an olive branch, because when you're bringing in mercenaries from Germany, we're never going to have peace again, because it's the line's been severed in some people's mentality. But very few casualties, because they're all, I don't know if they're all drunk or just tired or just surprised. But Washington wins a big valuable battle there, not only because we get some armament out of it and some weaponry, but it boosts the morale, because up until that point we were getting our butts whipped. But it's shortly thereafter that Fort Ticonderoga has. So the first successful battle we have, small, but it's symbolic, is the Battle of Trenton, Christmas Day, and in 1776. We know that a little later we win the battle against Handsome Johnny Burgoyne up in Fort Ticonderoga, New York, and that's when the French get in. I don't know if we could have, maybe over a long period of time of attrition, guerrilla warfare, we might have won the Revolutionary War, but the French brought the military in. Of the French military, it's still quite mighty, even though they lost to the British just 12, 13 years earlier, but they have a huge navy still, and that's the real turning point in the warfare. The British just did not pour their whole heart and soul into this battle. They had other regions in the country, in the world, I should say, to take care of. And they just did not put their full backbone into this thing. There's no question about it. That was a good fortune for us. and the other is the French come into it. And we know the big battle down in Virginia, which against Cornwallis in Yorktown, was basically the breaking point that it was all over. Cornwallis has to surrender. There's basically a surrounding of Cornwallis's military, and he thought he was going to get aid from the British Navy, but the French Navy was already surrounding the entire Chesapeake and the Virginia Bay areas, and he was trapped. Cornwallis had no escape to the sea, couldn't go any more south or west, and George Washington accepts surrender from Cornwallis, and it's considered to be over now. And then we start negotiating for peace. And it's really remarkable, and that's what happened. I don't know if it's a war that even should have been fought initially, because I thought the grievances were relatively minor, but who am I to say? I guess I'm not that much of a revolutionary minded person. But we know that's the constant in the slaves, we know we keep slavery in the United States. It doesn't end. But there's an argument that as a result of the Revolutionary War, more people start recognizing that slavery should end as an institution, mostly in the Northeast. But I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer here, but the Northeast just didn't need direct enslavement of people in terms of its economy the way the South did. I'd like to think that the Northeast was, more thoughtful about it, but it's not necessarily true. And we know this is the end of the Native Americans, mostly, not all, but most Native American groups fought with the British. And we now know that the British are gone, it's going to create Western expansion. That's part of the argument over the Revolutionary War, too, is the British Crown would not let us expand west of the Appalachian Mountain topography. And now the Native American strongholds, if you will, are lost because they don't have any British alliances anymore. We now recognize that when we leave the Revolutionary War, we believe in strong legislative bodies that are representative. We don't like too much power in one individual or groups of individual. So therefore, most colonies had fairly weak governors, or if any governor at all. Pennsylvania didn't have any governor, like a council group. And the issue of the judiciary is going to come up a little bit later, because there wasn't really clarity on that except for Massachusetts. We became more egalitarian after the Revolutionary War, more than any other country probably at that time. That doesn't mean everyone gets to participate, but pretty much white males in most communities, even those not owning property shortly thereafter, could participate in the democracy. And Americans started developing their own manufacturing. We no longer were just going to be a nation of importing under the consumer revolution. We're constantly importing good British goods, or ones we really wanted to aspire to. Now that we're starting to manufacture home, and now we're starting to trade with a lot more of the world's economies, because the British government is no longer going to be able to enforce the Navigation Acts. We know that the British government's not going to be completely gone. They stay in the Ohio River Valley for a period of time because they're looking for some reparations. They also stay up in Canada, and they're arguably a Canada part of the British Empire to this day. I'm just looking at some of the things to make sure. We know that some people started freeing their slaves as a result of whether they fought in the Revolutionary War for the revolutionary entity. But we know the British that actually had African Americans run away from slavery, join the British forces, actually were freed. They were either brought back to England, up to Nova Scotia. There was a large number of freed African American slaves by the British, and some were brought into the what we call the Caribbean or the West Indies, and so they held true to the word. Other American revolutionaries did manumit or free their slaves, but it wasn't on a broad-based scale, especially not in the South, which is too bad. So that's it. We start off as a new nation, and we'll get into the next chapter that we're not really a nation. We're 13 nations. The colonists, although unified in the Revolutionary War, are not viewed as one nation. They call themselves a confederacy, and that's just what it means. We're going to be united for some purposes, but not for others. And the purposes we're united for are very marginal. We lived from 1770. Peace is ultimately signed, I think, in 1783 at the Paris Peace Treaty. Up 1783 to 1787, what was that, 5 years? I think it started in 1781, though, technically. So 8 years under the Articles of Confederation, which isn't as bad as everyone says it is, but it is bad in terms of keeping the country together. But it does recognize us as a nation and as our first constitution. But I'll get to that in a later chapter. I went way long enough. I'm sorry to bore you to death, but I felt like I had to go that long. Be well.